23, 2025, a 14-year-old girl went to a house in the Hollywood Hills. According to investigators, it was supposed to be a short visit, but after that night, no one heard from her again. Days passed, then weeks, and for months her family had no answers about where she was or what had happened inside that house, until investigators searched a vehicle connected to the property. And inside it, they made a discovery they say would change the direction of the case completely. Because some stories don't begin with a crime, they begin with a moment, a decision, a place no one thought to question. This is Midnight Dark Cases, and this is the case of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. What prosecutors allege happened after that visit is still being examined in court today. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was 14 years old. She was at the age where most days still followed a familiar rhythm: school, family, friends, and small expectations that shaped ordinary days. There was nothing unusual about the way that week began, nothing that suggested anyone close to her had reason to worry. According to investigators, April 23rd started like any other day. There were no signs that anything was wrong. No indication that the evening ahead would become the last confirmed point in her timeline. Nothing about that day suggested it would be the last time anyone would hear from her. On April 23, 2025, Celeste Rivas Hernandez left home and, according to investigators, went to a residence in the Hollywood Hills later that evening. It was not described as an unusual trip. At the time, there was every expectation that she would return home afterward. Nothing about that visit initially suggested it would become the final confirmed point in her timeline. As the evening continued, the people closest to her expected to hear from her, but that contact never came. Hours passed without updates, calls were unanswered, and the window in which anyone could confirm where she was or who she was with began to narrow. At first, there was no reason to believe anything unusual had happened, but as more time passed, that changed. As the night continued, the silence became harder to explain. The people closest to Celeste expected to hear from her, but the messages they sent went unanswered, calls were not returned, and the longer that silence lasted, the more unusual it began to feel. What first looked like a delayed response slowly started to look like something else. Concern turned into uncertainty, and uncertainty quickly became a reason to act. According to investigators, her disappearance was reported soon after it became clear she was not returning home. From that point forward, the focus shifted from waiting for contact to trying to understand where she had gone. Search efforts began with the most immediate question investigators ask in cases like this: where was she last seen? To answer that, detectives started reconstructing her movements step by step, working backward through the final confirmed hours of April 23rd. And as investigators began retracing her steps, attention quickly turned to the last place she had been seen. As investigators reconstructed Celeste's final confirmed movements, their attention returned to the residence she had visited that evening in the Hollywood Hills. According to prosecutors, it was the last place she was known to have gone before contact with her stopped completely. That made the location central to understanding what might have happened after she arrived at the property. Detectives began speaking with people connected to the property, working to establish who had been there that night and what the timeline inside the home may have looked like. They compared statements, reviewed available records, and continued narrowing the window between the moment she was last known to be there and the moment communication with her ended. At the same time, investigators began gathering physical evidence from the location as part of the early stages of the case. Each step was part of a larger effort to determine whether her disappearance had been voluntary or whether something else had happened after she entered the house. As the investigation continued, that residence remained the most important place in the timeline, because if answers existed, investigators believed they were most likely connected to what happened there that night. At that point, investigators were still trying to understand what had happened inside that house that night. In the days that followed Celeste's disappearance, investigators continued working to reconstruct what had happened after she arrived at the Hollywood Hills residence. But as those early efforts continued, one critical question remained unanswered. Where was she? Days turned into weeks, and weeks gradually became months. During that time, detectives continued reviewing statements, examining evidence connected to the residence, and working to establish a clearer timeline of the final hours before contact with her ended. According to prosecutors, the investigation moved forward as authorities gathered information and presented evidence as part of a broader legal review process. A grand jury was later involved as investigators worked to determine what charges, if any, would follow. Even as the case progressed behind the scenes, one critical detail was still missing. Investigators still did not know where Celeste was. For her family, the uncertainty continued, and for months the case remained unresolved. Until investigators made a discovery they say changed everything. For months, no one knew where Celeste Rivas Hernandez was. Investigators had spent that time reconstructing timelines, reviewing evidence, and continuing to focus on the residence she had visited the night she disappeared. But according to prosecutors, in September 2025, that search led them somewhere new, to a vehicle connected to the property. Authorities examined a Tesla registered to the homeowner of the residence Celeste had visited on April 23rd, and inside that vehicle, investigators say they made a discovery: human remains. Officials later confirmed the remains were identified as Celeste Rivas Hernandez. After months of uncertainty, the question of where she was had finally been answered. But that discovery immediately raised another question: what had happened after she entered the house that night? From that point forward, the investigation moved into a new phase, as forensic specialists began examining the vehicle and the surrounding evidence connected to it. What had started as a disappearance was now being treated as a homicide investigation. And investigators say the discovery inside that vehicle would become one of the most important developments in the case. Following the discovery of Celeste's remains, investigators say the case moved quickly into a new stage. Prosecutors later identified the homeowner connected to the residence she had visited that night as the primary suspect in the investigation. According to charging documents filed by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, he was charged with first-degree murder in connection with her death. Additional allegations were also included as part of the case presented by prosecutors, reflecting the seriousness of what investigators believe took place after Celeste arrived at the property. Officials have stated that these allegations were supported by evidence gathered during the months-long investigation that followed her disappearance. At his arraignment, the defendant entered a plea of not guilty. Prosecutors have also indicated that the case includes special circumstances that could make it eligible for the death penalty if a conviction is ultimately secured. As the case now moves through the court system, investigators say the legal process will continue to examine the events surrounding the night Celeste was last seen. Authorities say the investigation remains ongoing as the case proceeds through the courts. Even after the discovery of Celeste's remains and the charges that followed, investigators say the case is still not fully resolved. According to prosecutors, there are still parts of the timeline surrounding the night of April 23, 2025, that continue to be examined as the investigation moves forward. Authorities have also indicated that determining the exact cause of death has been complicated by the condition of the remains at the time they were recovered. As a result, forensic analysis remains an important part of the case as investigators continue reviewing the available evidence. Authorities say additional details are expected to be addressed through the court process as proceedings continue. And while the discovery inside the vehicle answered one of the largest questions in the investigation, many others remain tied to what prosecutors allege happened inside that house that night. Even after the discovery, investigators say many questions about what happened that night remain part of the case. Stories like this don't always end when the video does. Sometimes the most important details only begin to surface later. If you follow cases like this closely, subscribe to Midnight Dark Cases so you don't miss what comes next.
And if you're watching from somewhere outside California or somewhere closer to where this happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I read every one, and it helps more people find these stories.